I guess we've come to the point where question and answer time is available to everyone. So let's just open the floor up. If you have a question, offer it, and we'll get some responses. Yes, sir.
Everybody's talking about the DNA and stuff, but DNA just half the puzzle. Isn't it how it's expressed? That's how you have two identical twins. Yes. One could develop a horrible cancer at 20, and the other one can be lived to be 103, even though it has identical. Like the environment affects the DNA. That's how you can have one species 1 million years ago lose its wings because particularly the environment didn't call for it. 1 million years later, the environment's changed. The species, the code is still there. I saw stuff on TV where they've taken chicken embryos and made them grow scales by tagging, making, I can't remember the word they used, but making the old dinosaur DNA that's still in the sequence, making it express.
That's a really cool story. So like that PAX gene I was talking about that helps control eye development, if you look at fish in caves that have lost their eyes, everybody's seen those. It's a result of expression levels of that PAX. So PAX is still there, it's still functional. There's just a different protein that's been upregulated to inhibit it. So all those right genes are still there to make eyes. If, say, a pool of these fish gets transplanted out of the cave, they might. There's no end goal with evolution, but they might acquire the capability to use their eyes again. Additionally, part of my research is what you were talking about with gene expression. It's called epigenetics. It's a really brand new field. I hesitate to kind of talk about it now, but one of the ways your genome keeps endogenous retroviruses quiet, like the really young ones that can still make virus, it changes how tight the DNA is wound up around these things called histones. If you picture like 8 beach balls stuck together, your DNA wraps around it so it can fit into your cells. That's how come you can fit all this length of DNA in this teeny tiny cell. And so what happens when you want the gene to be expressed, you make little modifications to these histones, and the DNA kind of relaxes so the machinery can get in and make RNA and proteins. And you don't want that to be expressed. You make different modifications that make that DNA snuggle up really tight. And actually we found dietary differences can affect how these modifications are made and how genes are expressed. So definitely there's another layer to the picture.
Yes.
Hi. It's for Dr. Jackson. I want to thank you for your presentation. It was really great to see your material reference. That always is helpful when someone wants to research what's been said. You can go back and refer to it. So I very much appreciate you doing that. In your presentation, of course, yours too, but I'm from your point of view, so I like to research what you're saying, so I appreciate that up front. My question is, you mentioned early on about with the variations about human evolution, how you discounted, I can't pronounce the Latin names of the two skulls that you pronounced, but you also mentioned Australopithecus as 3 non-human, not leading to human evolution, okay? What would be the purpose of having something like that exist if they're, for one, they die off, species die off, continuously. We've had many primates chains that have died off, but we do, and you admitted that with the apes, that with the non-human apes, that you do see common, evolution with those species, but you disconnect that with what, we call human or, higher level apes, Homo sapiens, species. Are you saying, for instance, that those are just apes that lost out on the dice roll, or are you saying that humans are involved in this world of evolution, but not a part of it?
I'm not saying that there's a world of evolution in any sense of the word at all, except change within limits. But when I'm talking about species like this, I'm talking about, yes, extinct monkeys. For instance, how many ever heard of Lucy? The Lucy fossil. That's Australopithecus afarensis. Lucy here is in the middle of this chart, which comes from Newsweek of 2007. It's very, very recent, up-to-date information. And you can see that the shaded areas are the period which the species is known to have existed based on fossil evidence. This is actually the layers of the rock. Evolutionists would call these millions of years, 4 million years, 5 million years, 6 million years, 7 million years ago. And it's at this depth in the rock that Lucy was found. The white shaded area represents actual evidence, facts, data, which creationists do not disagree with. You know, a lot of people think creationists don't believe in dinosaurs, that we don't believe that these little monkeys existed. Creationists believe that the Creator made humans and monkeys, no monkey humans. But we do have a whole lot of different kind of monkeys that are extinct now. And Lucy would be one, 3.5 feet tall, 65 pounds, and a brain 1/3 the size of ours, sounds like a monkey, and couldn't walk upright like a human. Then there's the Sahelanthropus chilensis that we mentioned, and Homo erectus is out of the running, those two because of DNA. And all of these are actually, these are a side branch that evolutionists never did think we evolved from. Homo neanderthalensis, or Neanderthal man, is now considered Homo sapiens neanderthalensis, just a subspecies of us. Their brains were bigger, they could talk, they had art, religion, and music, and they were not, in any sense, some sort of missing link. Heidelberg man has just recently, since this article came out, been reassigned the designation of an archaic Homo sapiens. Notice there are no dotted lines in the imagined flow of evolution leading from Lucy to Homo sapiens, us. There's a break right here. A problem with Africanus is that it's a million years later in the story, but looks more like a monkey than Lucy does. National Geographic just said evolution just went backwards. You see, to answer your question, I'm seeing these as extinct monkeys, like extinct dodo birds, the extinct European lion, the moa, and the T-Rex. These are many different kinds of creatures that did diversify, but within those limits that microevolution has. And that these things are not monkey people. They're either people or monkeys. It's clear this is a person. We're still fighting over what the Isle of Flores hobbit fossils really were, probably acronoplastic dwarfs, or maybe they were microencephalic, and there was a gene there. I'm still wondering what they really were, but they seemed to be intelligent and people, even though they were short like hobbits. And so, really, there's nothing left. This is now an archaic human. The only thing left in this story that hasn't been shot down by different analytical techniques as being the missing link is Homo antecessor. And you can see that the bar for how much actual data exists to substantiate what it was like is very, very slight. So I hope I didn't go too over, but I hope I also did answer your question. How do I see these things? Extinct monkeys.
Just real quick, where did this chart come from?
Here.
Okay, thank you.
You keep talking about the missing link, but the stuff I've read, there's no such thing as a missing link. It's, you know, our domestic dogs today are still directly related to the wolves. You know, they can still breed with each other. But you can look at a wolf and you look at a teacup chihuahua. If you just had these two fossils, you think, well, there's no way. Where's the missing link? There is no missing link. I mean, it's breeding, you know, and they're still species. I mean, they're not speciated with each other. You can still breed wolves and dogs together.
You're right.
But it seems like the main gist of your argument here is evolution too complex to come up with I mean, is you know, a bunch of protoplasm floating around in the soup. Life is too complex to become from there to here in 3.5 billion years. Is that the gist of your argument?
Oh no, I would never say that the complexity issue is the downfall of evolution, because evolution has a theory about the complexity. It is based on the assumption that random mutations can write new genetic material that actually makes sense above and beyond the way the species was to begin with. natural selection could then weed out things that worked and keep things that did. But natural selection, it's been said, can explain the survival of the fittest. It can tell you why certain wildebeests survive, they're faster, can run away from the lions. But how you got wildebeests and lions in the beginning cannot be explained by natural selection. It only is a screening process, and it's not a creative process. Stephen Jay Gould said that. And so what still remains in the evolution theory is how to produce the raw material for evolution. What I'm saying is, for natural selection work, what I'm saying is that, complex or not, you can't get even moderate complex code to be written that's meaningful when you tamper with it by accidental mutations. I could see it happening in viruses. We see it all the time. We observe that. I can see it happening in bacteria to some extent, a lesser extent. We do see that. We don't see, and indeed, if you were to dig up a teacup chihuahua and a timber wolf, you would never think that those two were related unless you somehow did the DNA testing and found out. Of course, there are mechanical reasons why timber wolves and chihuahuas don't mate. There are social reasons why they don't mate. Probably one would have the other for a meal instead is what would happen. But wolves, hyenas, jackals, foxes, and dogs are all interfertile. We would say as creationists that the Creator made dogs, and that was them. And two dogs got off Noah's Ark, and we got all these things and could get all these things because dogs are so very plastic in their genetics. They're so variable. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but one of my problems is if you say make it correct, but it's pretty. I mean, I don't want to get off topic, but if
this is what the question answers for.
You go back to the Creator thing. If the world is too complex to come out of anything, then how can you have a pre-existing entity create it all? But I really want to get off.
That actually gets into a philosophical question about infinity. If there is a God, whether you're an atheist or a believer or not, if there's a God, it has to be infinite, or what kind of God is that? You know, Richard Dawkins even said, if there was a God, the God would have to be so incredibly beyond us, you shouldn't even start to try and conceive of it. So infinity is not something we can conceive. We make a sideways 8 and we think we're on top of this thing. Total arrogance and ignorance, really. Blameless ignorance, but ignorance. We also cannot conceive of nothing. We cannot conceive of, before the evolutionist theory of the Big Bang, that there was no space. We can think of empty space because we consider air to be that, even though it's not. So I'm saying that God wouldn't need to be made. And that seems out of our framework, but so is the Big Bang. However the world, the universe got started, however life got on this planet, it's incredibly fantastical and does take faith. I don't care what you believe about how life and the universe and this planet got here. It takes faith, and there's no faith in something. And you can faith whatever you want, you know. But if Marilyn Vosavant said, be always ready to give some sort of a rationale to your argument, otherwise all you have is an opinion.
Well, it seems like a lot of your argument here is just kind of finding holes in the evolutionist argument.
That's a debate.
I thought this is what it is.
Yeah, and I can give a genetic support for the creation model also, but that I can do that if you would like me to, but that would be another talk, of course. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
I'm coming now from an area which I absolutely have no insight. I'm learning a lot from both of your presentations, and you're making it very clear that this does need to be taken seriously by our youth. Science, not run from it, get involved with it. I'm coming from a different perspective. If I'm understanding what you're saying, you do not have a lot of disagreement with evolution in the micro sense.
Because we see it.
Within a species.
Yeah, we see that all the time. That's clear.
So what's the difference with macro? Is that simply that it moves from one species to a specific, an additional species? Is that what macro in your definition is?
With micro, you can just reshuffle the genes. Think of it as shuffling a deck of cards and rearranging the deck. You give out a new hand every time, and you can get something slightly different, but you're still dealing from the same deck. Now, you're not going to get an Uno card out of an old-made deck, you see, unless a new card is created, and that's what evolution demands for the origin of a new species. And That's what we don't see.
And your
So that's where I draw the line.
And
Yes.
your perspective is that the deity, at some point in the past, created these two different decks.
Two different whats?
Decks, the Olmec.
Yes. Okay, you're going back to the analogy.
Yeah,
Yeah, like the lizard deck and the bird deck, and that birds did not evolve from dinosaurs, yeah.
okay, now, of course, I'm not in a spot to be able to even ask good questions about that, so I'm coming from
You're doing it.
from a perspective of the book of Genesis. Is microevolution simply saying that creation is continuing, that it's going on?
Oh, no. No, microevolution is merely the genetic drift, like I said, reshuffling, recombination. It's reason why you may look a little like your cousin, even more than you do look like your brother. It's taking that deck and reshuffling a new hand out to the next generation.
That's still the human deck, as far as you're concerned.
Sure. Yes, you've got to get new cards created somehow by an undirected process for evolution to proceed. You must get new genes with new genetic information and new DNA that actually works in order to originate a new species. Now, you can say that two species got separated from each other and they couldn't breed anymore, kind of like the Chihuahua and the Timberwolf can't breed anymore for obvious reasons, but they're still Canis. They're still Canidae, and really, since they are interfertile genetically, they're the same species by the old definition of species and by the creationary definition of species. Those are you can have little teeny poodles, and you can have those wolf-sized poodles too. They're still Canis. You can call them Canis familiaris, you can call them Canis lupus, but it's Canis.
Within the creation spectrum, is there some anticipation or fear or dislike of having an ancestry that might have come from a different creature, the Homo erectus and others, which you refer to as extinct monkeys?
Now that's where the creationists have to stop fooling themselves. We shouldn't be looking for nothing because we have a like or a dislike, or because we have a favorite theory, or because we're going to get endowed chairmanships or tenure or approval of other people. Science, like religion, had better be a search for the truth, or you're a hypocrite. That's how I feel about that.
The next question is for Abby. Abby, now, you've heard my questions that come from an absolute novice when it comes to DNA and both of your backgrounds. But I come from a faith tradition, and I am not bothered by separate decks that may eventually have evolved into human beings. I do not see that as something which violates my faith and my understanding. I really have some difficulty with accepting the second chapter of Genesis as literal when the female is supposed to have been created out of the rib of the male. I just don't see that as being scientifically defensible. But Abby, my question to you is, if you can remember what I asked, because I don't think I can repeat it. If you understood what I was asking, is there something to be perhaps disliked about coming from an earlier species which was not truly human, but now we have defined as humans at the top of the scale? Is there something inherently bad about that?
Can I go back to the question you asked before that about how is microevolution a continuation of creation? I would think from a theistic evolutionary perspective that a retrovirus, a part of a retrovirus being used to create mammals that would one day become species that we see today, I would think that is really cool. That is a cool idea. But I really like viruses, so I'm a little biased. So I think the kind of continuing creation that we see is even more phenomenal than the original creation. Like, it just keeps going. That's cool. But about the question you asked, I don't have a problem. I really, personally, just from a scientist perspective, I have difficulty doing research on primates. We have to for HIV research. It's the only way we can do clinical trials on HIV vaccines. But personally, the relationship I think we have with them and their higher order of thinking, it really does bother me that we have to do this kind of research. But then again, just from our perspective, we try to limit suffering and that sort of thing, make sure we can get the most good information out of those kinds of studies as we can.
Oh, now we go. Okay.
Questions for Abby. First of all, I'd like to say I appreciate your attempt to actually further the discussion by engaging responses you've seen, like in the creationist response thing. I attended the Dembski-Roos debate a few weeks ago, and that did not happen. It was terrible because they did not attempt to advance the conversation by anticipating the other guy's responses that they'd seen before. So it was like we were back at square one 20 years ago. So anyway, I appreciate that. I wish we saw more of that. You said that we share mistakes with other organisms, and these mistakes do not make sense in any other paradigm. If I could just paint a really brief picture for you, imagine an omnipotent God who creates all the life on the earth, and not necessarily exactly as we see it today, but fairly similar, sort of. And then sin enters the world through the fall of man. And sin has a very deleterious effect on all sorts of things, not just on morality and actions and such, but also on the world as we see it. We see all the bad stuff that happens, and including on the genetic code as well. So the reason you came here was to provide a molecular genetic case or whatever against creationism and for evolution. Why do these mistakes rule out creationism necessarily when they can very easily be explained by the idea of a Christian God who created the world more or less as we see it, but then had sin into the world to screw stuff up?
I absolutely agree, except for the specificity of the mistakes we see. So again, to go back to my little Lego analogy, pretend the little girl was playing with her Legos and her dog came by and chewed up one of her little yellow blocks. Well, it still worked, it's still fine, so she puts it in her castle. But then she goes to all her yellow blocks and has her dog chew those pieces exactly the same way and puts that in her spaceship and puts that in her dinosaur. To see very specific mutations that happen the same way in us and primates and other organisms, I don't think that would make as much sense as common descent.
Given that the Christian doctrine includes a God who has ordained everything that comes to pass, and therefore is in control of every event that ever occurs in the planet and the universe, including on the molecular microscopic level, again, why would that explanation make more sense than a God who directed it that way? Since you're trying to disprove creationism, so far without a good rebuttal to this, they're at least on the same level.
Well, I would just say if your God went to that much trouble to leave a trail of breadcrumbs that would lead us to a conclusion that's false, that's kind of sneaky. And I don't see its particular goal in doing that. But then again, your God is infinite, so there might be something down the road that all these mistakes totally make sense. But right now, that's what they show us.
Could you please explain why the fact that your inability to see the goal or the reason for the breadcrumb trail means that it didn't actually happen that way?
Oh, it doesn't at all. There could absolutely be a reason for those mistakes and some sort of trickster God, but we can't really make those assumptions in science. We have to look at those genes, say, they've kind of got these same mistakes in the exact same location. To us, it makes sense that they were descended from a common ancestor. That's all we can say. We can't go into a lab and be like, well, God's going to cure AIDS in a week. We know it. We know it. We know it. We can't do that.
Of course, nobody's saying that. Just final question. This, I guess, is, would you say that this is because you are invested and 100% committed to a naturalistic worldview a priori before you come into the lab?
Oh, but I'm not. On Dawkins' scale, I'm at the same location he is, 6.999. Scientists, we are absolutely slaves to evidence. If you give us evidence, we have to believe it, or we fight tooth and nail to disprove it, and then we get to be the head honchos in the field, and it feels really good. So if there's an inherent flaw in evolution, then it should be one of my main goals to overthrow it, because that's how I get a paper in science. That's how I get a paper in Nature. Yeah.
I'd like to thank you both for the informative talk. My question goes to the doctor here. I'm sorry. Dr. Jackson.
Oh, give me 3 years.
And basically, I'd like to know how, even though you're agreeing with evolution, and to a limited extent,
If you want to call it that.
Even if it's that much.
You know, I think we shouldn't call it microevolution. We should call it micro-variation. Because when you say the word evolution, even in a small sense, everyone immediately jumps to worms became bald eagles, which is what the theory said. And of course, I don't believe that. So I prefer to call it micro-variation within the species.
And in fairness, I mean, there's no evolutionist that's actually saying that worms turn into bald eagles.
Oh yes, every one of them says that. That's the theory.
We shared.
Okay,
Yes.
we'll leave it at that then. But
That is the theory.
how do we then take the leap that there's an intelligent creator from seeing evidence and saying that we don't know something, we don't know how macroevolution happened, we don't have that knowledge at this point, but we're going to inject God into the equation and say that, well, because we don't know, God did it.
Well, you say that we don't know how macroevolution happened. You forgot to say we don't know if macroevolution happened, and that's the problem with assumptions. Again, I said there's nothing wrong with assumptions, but if you gloss over them and then speak the assumption as though it is a given, now we are fooling ourselves, you see, and we are not data-driven any longer. We are building an assumption upon an assumption, and these things may support one another, and it may be called parsimony if you want to, but it's still, Simon says lift one leg, Simon says lift the other, it doesn't matter. You've still got to have some foot on the ground with these things. There's data. Evidence isn't proof, but you've got to go where the data most clearly leads, or you're being disingenuous. And you may have your favorite theory, but eventually data piles up, like finding red blood cells in a 68 million year old Tyrannosaurus rex vein. I mean the actual blood cells that were still there. That should give the evolutionary time frame some problem. And pasteurize after this man's done, somebody's got to call on this kid with the red hat. It's like some kind of windmill in the back. So yes, but sir, I don't know if you were done with your question or not. Could you please continue if you're not?
Well, I just wanted to say along with that, and if we're making wild assumptions based on evidence, where is the evidence that is leading us in the direction of an intelligent creator?
The exact same evidence that might lead someone to say that there was no design, that design emerged from a designless process. We see the world, we see life, we see the planet, we see the universe, and it's only what's under the water of the tip of the iceberg that we disagree on. How it got here, again, it demands an enormous amount of faith that worms became bald eagles. It demands an enormous amount of faith that chemicals floating loose in the ocean actually, inorganic, simple chemicals, generated complex organic chemicals that were then capable of wrapping themselves up in a membrane and then having cellular activity, becoming alive and reproducing. That takes, I think, some assumptions, many assumptions. One, that the law of spontaneous generation, is true, that things can spontaneously generate. Every evolutionist believes that spontaneous generation happened at least once. That's undeniable. It is a faith, and I have no problem with that. You see what's here, and then you think, how did it get here? You can have different stories on that, and then you, of course, have your own wagon load of assumptions that come with it. Believe in evolution if you want, but I think from what we've done tonight, you can't believe in it for any of the things that I refuted, and I think you're going to have to take some measure of trust to say that the endogenous retrovirus sequences indeed couldn't come about by any other means but common descent, that indeed it could never have happened over the period of time since life has been on Earth just by different species being invaded by the same viruses. Does that answer your question?
That does, and in fairness to her, she also said that it could be two separate spontaneous events, or common descent.
Well, of course,
You can tell the difference.
and those would not be indicative of common descent if they were separate.
I have a question for both of you. You said we're so closely related to animals. Is it possible if we can transplant animal organs to our organs?
We do that.
Or the other way around?
That's a super cool story. Can I start?
Go ahead.
So, the evolution of your immune system, it turns out that this really important protein that says, it's just like a normal housekeeping protein. It says everything's normal, everything's fine. If you take, say, your liver and put it in meat without doing any tests, your everything fine proteins are not my everything's fine proteins. So my immune cells freak out and attack your liver. So that's why you have to do special testing before you can get transplants. Well, it turns out that pigs are a really good match for these everything fine proteins to humans. The problem is pigs are also infected with endogenous retroviruses, and some of them are much younger than the ones that have infected us, so they can still make viral particles. And so what we're afraid of is that we give someone a heart from a pig, and all of a sudden we start getting these retroviruses produced and they infect a human, and then we've got a whole other HIV crisis on our hands. So what some people are doing in, I believe, Australia, is trying to breed pigs to get rid of all of their almost functional endogenous retroviruses, and they're in a very sterile environment. So theoretically, we could use them as a source for organs.
Theoretically, yes, we could. As you know, you have to get a close tissue match even between two humans. We've been thinking about using baboon organs. They're close enough. And people who were on insulin before we genetically engineered bacteria to generate insulin were using porcine insulin from pig pancreases. And they would sometimes be allergic to it, they'd have to get used to it, their system would have to adjust. And then after they switched to the new human insulin that was being cranked out by these genetically engineered bacteria, some of the people showed an allergic reaction because they'd accommodated to the pig insulin. So the immune system is a funny thing, but it is watching out for you. And there are dreams of course, cloning your heart cells and keeping a spare in case you need it. People are talking more openly about that than exotransplants, interspecies transplants. But that, I think, is still being discussed.
For Abby, a question for you. You know how like you said that species can mate with others, like their own species? What if you get a human and an ape or something from that species? What would happen?
I have no idea. Like, I've heard creepy stories about them trying that in, like, Soviet Russia, but I don't know anything above, like, rumors. I think that's one of those ethical things that's not going to be a line that's crossed.
I think we can agree on that.
Yeah, we agree. Humans and apes and
I had a question for Dr. Jackson. It sounds as though a lot of your argument is ain't so, ain't so, ain't so. So I had a question relative to what your position is. I would appreciate your putting an age on the universe, an age on the Earth, and an age on the KT boundary.
KT boundary is in dispute in the creation model. It's seen as being sometime after Noah's flood. Age of the Earth.
I was more interested in years, not.
Okay. So we're talking about something like 4,000 years ago.
For the KT boundary?
Yes. And that would explain, too, why we can have complex biomolecules still existing in tissues that are found in dinosaur fossil material. Find a dinosaur bone that is not mineralized all the way to the center, that is not petrified all the way to the center. What on earth are you going to do about that? And you've got blood actually in it. Now, this was not just one lone case. We found this in a Triceratops, T-Rex at the lower right-hand corner, and a mosasaur. And here it says, here 2 likely red blood cells are seen within a possible blood vessel running through fibrous bone matrix. Possible blood vessel, likely red blood cells. This is what they look like under the microscope when you make fresh tissue slides. Many evolutionists have tried to say those are not really red blood cells. Well, look, they're exactly the same size as a red blood cell. They're red, and they're in a vein, and they're the same shape. They'll say these are biofilms that have been generated by rafts of bacteria. Well, they just happen to be the same size and shape and color as red blood cells, and they're all crowding through this vein. This bone, when it was cracked open, stunk like a cadaver. It's from the Hell Creek Formation in the Badlands of Montana. And this kind of thing makes the idea that dinosaurs lived 4,000 years ago not sounding quite so stupid. This is actually data. It's there. There's collagen proteins, and according to the laws of chemistry, proteins should totally fall apart into their monomers, into amino acids, after 40,000, 100,000 years, tops. So this is totally unanswerable, and it actually is evidence for a much younger Earth. And you asked about the Earth. I think, because I'm a biblical creationist, take the Bible literally, and then I look at the science to see, now if I see science is going to take me away from this, I'll dump this Bible ridiculous stuff, and I'll quit going to this church thing. But so far, I haven't had any occasion to do that. I'm looking at the data, I'm looking at the evidence, I'm looking at things, I'm looking at the world. I think the Earth's like 6,000 years old. The universe, even
according to Usher, it's 613.
Yeah, what?
6,000.
Oh, okay, well if you're going to be strict, I was rounding. The universe could be a little bit different because even the Big Bang Theory says that the universe was created somewhat similarly to the way the Bible says, is that God stretched out the universe. The Big Bang stretched out space. If you stretch space, you stretch time. It's very clear that Andromeda, 2 million light years away, doesn't look that way today. It might not even be there, and indeed might not be the way it looked 2 million years ago in its time. And so that's a whole other talk, but I do believe that we've only been here 6,000 years, and there's a time perspective in other parts of the universe. I believe it all did start 6,000 years ago, but some places are more time-stretched parts of the universe. And I'm just looking at a theory that's based on relativity. Some of these more time-stretched areas have experienced more time than we have had on Earth, but we're near the center of the stretch.
At some other time, I'd be glad to sit and discuss.
Yeah, that would be. You asked a loaded one.
The energy and particles and so forth would seem to be at conflict with yours, but
the energy of particles.
When you get to stretching time, the frequencies of wavelengths of light and so forth are all affected by the spacing within atoms and so forth. You're going to have a really bizarre mix of physics if you start stretching the universe and have all of these things consistent with what we see.
Well, indeed, that's what the Big Bang theorist hypothesizes, a bizarre mix of physics at the beginning, yes.
I would like to offer Alan, you're welcome to come over to my house. Abby might give hers. I'm sure that my house is much more inundated with sin. And if you can come over and measure it, compare it to yours, I'd be interested in seeing how much more sin my house has on a measurable basis than your house.
Sorry, Roe and I go way back.
This is the question for each of you. I'd like each to address it. What are telomeres doing in the middle of human chromosome number 2?
We would both say the same thing. Fusion of 2 chromosomes into 1 in the human history, yes. Wouldn't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what happened. Now, the reason we agree on that is because it's transparent to the issue of common descent. That particular matter is not in dispute, and it's transparent.
So, does the new chromosome, which used to be 2 chromosomes, count as new material?
Why would it? It'd be like gluing 2 books together. Do you have new material now? No.
You're saying that human chromosome 2 codes pretty much the same way as 2 previous chromosomes with their actual telomeres in place. That's what you said, right?
Sure, and that would be obvious, and that would be what we observe.
Okay.
And how would that
So
have anything to do with whether common descent is true?
What would be, again, we can't really ask these questions because we can't really get the answer, but what would exactly be the point of taking 2 things that were independently functional and fusing them together?
These things just happen. It wouldn't be. Now, we're not talking about something that happened at the creation. We're talking about something that was post the creation. This fusion.
So chimpanzees are closer to the original creation than humans are?
No, they're exactly as far away from it as we are. But we had something happen to us that didn't happen to them along the way. It's like when you were 4, if you fell off your tricycle, you got a scab on your knee that, same place where I don't have a scar, just because of different histories. Yes.
You really believe that fusing them is not going to change the way things turn out in phenotype? Really?
Not unless you have a duplication like in Downs.
So we can split it up and still have human descent. Really?
Don't you think that we could?
Let's have a go.
We do.
Well, why would we want to do that?
Let's look at your chromosome number 2 and see if the clones come out looking anything like you.
Is there a point to that? Of course they would, wouldn't they?
Stem cell research is legal now.
I mean, you know, I don't see any, and I see that as transparent to the two models. Both models would 100% agree on what would happen if you did that. Like with a 2114 translocation for Down syndrome. I don't see what you're trying to say.
You're saying at that time, the time that this fusion happened, it happened to every single person on the face of the planet.
Don't forget the creation model has a genetic bottleneck 4,359 years ago, right? Right. There were 3 breeding couples left, and if they all had the fusion, everybody's got it today. Every evolutionist today believes that every walking, living, breathing human being is descended from one of 4 gene pools. Is that not true? Is that not true?
I don't go that far back.
Well, it is. It's in Kenneth Miller's textbook that I showed the picture of. 4 gene pools. And if you've got 3 brothers on the ark, and they're from the same gene pool, and they got 3 wives who hopefully weren't too inbreeding, and they were from 3 different families, that makes 4 gene pools on the ark. Now, there's some genetic evidence that goes so well with the theory. Of course, I didn't just prove Noah's Ark, but it certainly goes with it. And yes, if you can get all the diversity we have today from 3 gene pools, then you can get it from the people on the ark. I would be 100% willing a month from today to debate a geneticist on that exact question. Sure. Yes, from 3 breeding pairs. That would be perfectly, I'd be very happy to do that.
There's also a population genetics concept of the minimum viable population, which is one of the reasons why we're so concerned about endangered species, is when we get very, very few in number. They're always susceptible to just randomly getting killed, and then you have the genetics problem. So there are problems with only having...
Which is also because of the mutations that have built up, but 4,000 years ago wouldn't be as many.
But mutations can sometimes be good things. As we see with endogenous retroviruses, I mean, they're totally a mistake that we do not want functional.
Well, are
but
they
yet
a mutation?
We can still use those, well, you don't just get a retrovirus that suddenly gets turned into a placenta. I mean, you have mutations that accumulate over time that eventually the end product just happens to be what we call a placenta today. But absolutely mutations can be good things. They aren't always deleterious.
Doesn't that make the assumption that all placental mammals are only placental generated because of an endogenous retrovirus?
Absolutely. But that entire endogenous retrovirus isn't functional. They just slowly domesticated a protein from an endogenous retrovirus over the course of time.
Well, that is what the theory says, that once the viral DNA entered the genome, then it was domesticated. Now that sounds authoritative, but it's a mechanism that's assumed in the word domesticated. This is the theory. This is the assumption that's made. And like I said, I have no problem with making assumptions. But to say that we know that an endogenous retrovirus is the reason there's a third branch of mammals.
No, if you knock it out, you don't get babies anymore. They did it in sheep, I believe.
You don't get babies anymore. So there's no other pseudogenes that are there that could do this?
Well, it is sufficient. It is necessary and sufficient.
Today.
But mutations can be good.
Is an endogenous retrovirus a mutation?
Yeah.
Where does it come from? Outside. It comes from a virus. It's not something generated within the genome itself. Now, once it's in there, it can mutate, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So endogenous retroviruses aren't a mutation.
They're a change in the original genome.
They are genetic material that's borrowed from another organism, true?
That isn't normally there.
That isn't normally there. Okay, so it's coming from another deck of cards. Okay.
Have you read the Bible from
my parents made sure that I did, and I also read various Islamic tales and Buddhist tales, and my favorite when I was little were the Egyptian tales. Hathor, the coolest god ever. Just look that up on Wikipedia. But yes, but the thing is, I was taught evolution by two theistic evolutionists, and one was a Quaker and one was a Methodist. Part of my family is Catholic, and they don't particularly have a problem with evolution. So I don't like that disconnect. He said if you suddenly started believing evolution, you would quit going to church. You don't have to do that, unless I guess if you go to a church that absolutely demands that the Earth is 6,000 years old. But then I think it's a personal change and a personal belief. It's like I couldn't.
So you think you'll go to heaven when you pass?
I don't know if a heaven exists, personally, but I can come back and talk to you all about that later.
Okay, let's go back over here.
My question is directed more at the audience here. If there are any officials with the church, pastors, I'd like to know if there's a discussion group, say a religious education group, that meets periodically and, say, reads religious texts. And if so, if such a group would be willing to honor this discussion and honor Dr. Jackson in particular, no offense, Abby, but Dr. Jackson twice quoted Richard Feynman, saying that science is a long history of learning how not to fool ourselves. I would highly recommend that everybody read Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, or any of his other books. So I challenge the church, challenge members of the church to do just that. So we're going to honor Dr. Jackson and Abby, and that's a great quote. Big fan of Richard Feynman. I'd like to thank you for reminding me of what the wit and wisdom of Feynman, and I'm going to go home and dig up some Richard Feynman and read it. So thanks for that.
Excuse me, Doctor. You even learned about the God particle that they're talking about now, the Higgs boson?
Which we've been trying to find at CERN, and they'll fire it back up again in November. We don't know. It's our lust for infinity. We want to find the smallest to prove there isn't anything smaller. We want to find the farthest with the Deep Field Hubble telescope, and we would love to find the end of the universe. It's again this uncomfortableness we have with the concept of infinite. It's, I think, the same reason that many people are uncomfortable with the idea of a supreme being or God on a visceral level, not on a data-driven level, is because of the problem with trying to calculate infinity. And the Higgs boson, referred to as the God particle, I think kind of shows that quest for the infinitely small, wouldn't you say?
And if they can produce that one single particle with a superfly, what do you think will happen after that?
Well, Stephen Hawking thinks they'll form a lot of little microscopic black holes, but they'll blip right back out of existence too quickly for them to suck us all in. Everyone is all worried about that. What do I think will happen? I'm actually not a particle physicist. I find it interesting, as you do. I'm waiting to see what they find out. I think it's delightful research. I taught high school and college chemistry for 8 years, and of course I was always just trying to stick with proton, neutron, and electron. When they asked a little more, we'd go into, quarks and talk about leptons and baryons, and then of course we talk about things that are make-believe, like gravitons, and we talk about gravitrinos when we talk about the antimatter version of a make-believe particles. It's very, very theoretical stuff. That's why they want to get some data on these things, because so much of it is theoretical. It's good stuff, but we're discovering the universe, and contrary to what some people might tell you, belief in God, at least for me, I can say, doesn't stifle my scientific curiosity. Isaac Newton is cited as saying this, but he was really quoting somebody else. All of science is thinking God's thoughts after him. And I'm convinced that honest religionists and honest scientists will come to the same conclusion one day, that there is one truth. Look, how life got here on this planet is history. You're too late to prove you're right. It's already happened. It's historical. Our job is to find out what that was. Same thing with the origin of the Earth and the universe. And that's the only honest way to approach it. I hope that did. Yeah.
I've got one for Aggie. Away from your safe zone, what's your opinion on how all these seashells got on top of the tallest mountains all over the world? Did they evolve there, or maybe was there some great flood?
Well, I spent a part of my time in Nebraska, and their state capital is made of some really cool rock. Like they've got a little mosaic that follows the evolution of life using like really cool rock that's got all those seashells in it. That's how much I know about those rocks and seashells. But I would say that to me it makes sense that with plate tectonics and how things have changed over time, the things that used to be covered in water are now no longer covered in water.
So that the Earth was at one time maybe totally encompassed in water.
Where we're at here,
No, I would say that the land was differentially arranged and mountaintops from plate tectonics and that sort of thing. But that's as far as I go.
This is one of those things that I think creationists probably should not say, because your mainstream creation researchers believe in plate tectonics and see the evidence of that mountains have been hoisted up from the bottoms of the oceans, and that's why we find seashells in the Himalayas, not because the Himalayas were covered with water. At one time we believed that the mountain building occurred after the flood. We didn't have mountains of that scale at the time of Noah's flood. But what we do have predicted by the flood geology model is that you should have continent scale deltas, continent scale deposits of rock that go not only across an entire continent, but have their counterparts on several other continents. We've got the St. Peter sandstone, the Austin chalk, the Tapete sandstone. These things outcrop all over the mainland United States and outcrop in England and Germany. According to the creation model, the floodwaters in Noah's flood were washed across the continent. This is the only mechanical way to get a uniform sandstone layer that covers an entire continent. You're not going to get a river delta to do that. There's the Mississippi River Delta, and that's one of the world's biggest. And you just can't get an entire continent covered in delta. And a shallow inland sea, well, many of these sandstone layers are not limey. They have no evidence of saltwater benthic forms, in other words, clamshells. They do have lime cementing sometimes it's quartz instead. It dissolves. So you've got a real problem in geology if you don't believe the flood model.
Thank you both for being here tonight. Just to try to get it back, I have a quick question about genetics and molecules. I thought I'd ask something on the lines of gene expression, and going back to Abby about the question about the fish in the caves and how they lose their vision, and if you bring them out, about how they may, again, be able to assume that ability to see over time. And so I thought it might help the audience, since I do personally a lot of research and I read a lot of the stuff that Dr. Jackson does in our work and our research about this type of gene expression, and how sometimes it's more about how the genes are expressed and over time, not so much adding in new genetic material, but actually how the genes themselves are expressed. And I thought it might actually be beneficial to the audience to understand that.
That was one of the first things they looked at after both the chimpanzee and human genomes were sequenced, because they looked at it and they were like, okay, these are basically the same. What exactly is making a chimpanzee and a human? And so they did a technique called a microarray, where you look at the expression, the RNA message that gets made in a chimpanzee cell versus a human cell in lots of different tissues. And they found that, yeah, the genes are the same, but sometimes it's the expression levels that are changed, and that sometimes causes the differences. And I think they found, especially in the brain, that's where there were a lot of differences. But I could find that citation of someone now.
This is what you're talking about here. The FOXP2 gene that has to do with brain development. It was Svante Pabo doing the Chimp Genome Project, Neanderthal Genome Project, said that he reported that a gene known as FOXP2, which plays a role in language acquisition, produces a subtly different protein in humans than in chimps. Although the difference is small, just 2 amino acids, it's most likely significant since the alteration was strongly favored by natural selection. That's evolution creeping into the story there. Starting less than 200,000 years ago, there it again, around the time when human being language took a great leap forward. But gene sequences alone do not tell the whole story. Now that's only 2 amino acids different. Most proteins are 400 or 500. That's your average protein. How many amino acids? It's only 2 different. Clearly, there's more going on. There's a whole lot of stuff that needs to be looked at with this epigenetics. There's a whole lot that needs to be looked at as far as what each gene does and how they affect the other genes. So we've only scratched the surface and begun now that we have these sequences and we have new technology to probe how genes actually work. We're finding out we were infants, 5 years ago, and we just only realize we're toddling around in that. So that opens it wide open for all of us to stand back and wonder, of course. Creationists will say, what a mighty God we serve, what an infinitely imaginative, ingenious design, which has had built-in safeguards to try and manage the damages that would occur in the centuries and generations to come, which is why it's not perfect now, and why it's all weedy with a whole lot of baggage it's carrying.
And sometimes expression levels are different because of what I was talking about with the stolen promoters from endogenous retroviruses. There's a really cool story about how humans actually gained a lost portion of our immune system. It actually accumulated some mutations that were deleterious, and an endogenous retrovirus plopped down in front of it and allowed it to regain its functionality by stealing its promoter. So, again, from the evolutionary perspective, a lot of the changes in gene expression, they aren't just happening by random chance. There are mutations happening in the promoter regions that change the expression levels.
I guess just to clarify, that would be the big difference between the creationist side and the evolutionist side, is that they totally agree that there are changes in the genetic code, that there are definitely different ways that genes express themselves. The creationists just say we're not ever going to get new material added in that will make the species change from one to another, and you can actually lose the expression, and you can gain it back over time, because you're still going to have the same species. You're not ever going to have something becoming something else. Just like we've actually seen in our research, I think you and I work with, where a snake put in a different environment actually lost the ability to, its genome actually changed. It actually lost certain gene expression, and its genome changed, where it wasn't even venomous anymore. But it didn't actually gain new genetic material. It had it there all the time. It was just expressed different.
Well, if I could go back to HIV, that's kind of something Michael Behe said, was that HIV is this prime evolutionary machine, and it can't make anything new. But the problem is that there's a different kind of HIV called HIV2 that has a gene HIV1 doesn't have due to a gene duplication and divergence like I talked about. And then HIV1 has a gene that HIV2 doesn't have. And it actually happened a while back and we can't figure out where it came from. But HIV1 and HIV2, some people would look at that and say, oh, they're both still viruses. That's unimpressive. But they behave in very different ways. They're different viruses. So to say, oh, it's still just a snake, it didn't get anything, to say, oh, it's still just a virus, I'd say that's a very simplistic way of looking at what things are.
So gene duplication would be that gluing of 2 books together. Actually, it would be making a Xerox copy. It's getting 2 copies of the same book.
They subsequently diverge.
And then afterwards, one book changes while the other one stays the same.
Maybe like smacking 2 Kindles together.
Okay, I just wanted to clarify something before I ask my question, because it sounds like to me that we're talking about two different beliefs, one of creation, one of evolution. And Dr. Jackson, just to clarify, you said that you were taking the facts and under your certain bias, were choosing to see them a certain way. Is that correct?
As every single living, breathing person does, yes.
Not arguing that. Abby, the question I have is for you, but I also you said that as a scientist, you aren't coming from any area of bias because only the evidence is what matters. Is that, you guys said this a while back, so I just want to make sure that was the case. I'm not taking it out of context. Was that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So what I say, what draws the line between a scientist and a kook is that a kook is unwilling to let go of a pet hypothesis after he's been proven wrong.
Totally agree, completely. But here's something else. Obviously, the people in this room believe in either evolution or creation, and they think that it's right, because why would you hold on to a belief that you know to be wrong? That would be, like you just said, a kook. I guess what I'm getting at is I don't see, as Dr. Jackson just said, I don't see how it's possible to come at evidence without some sort of bias. And I really hate that I'm doing this because I think it's poor, but because I don't mean any disrespect in any way, shape, or form by using your words, but you said that this God, this deity, okay, if in fact left a trail of breadcrumbs for us to find, you would suppose that could be the case if he was some sort of a tricky God. To me, that shows that there is a bias, because there were a lot of things that, my parents, that your parents told us as we were growing up that we didn't quite understand, and that didn't automatically mean that our parents were being tricky. It just meant at the time, given the information that we had, it didn't make sense. So again, not to just pick apart your words, but it sounds to me like, just as Dr. Jackson has said, that yes, he is coming at it with a bias, because everyone does. It sounds to me that, just like everybody else, you would be coming from a bias because you chose to use the word tricky instead of just saying that there's a part of something that we don't understand. But that,
there could be.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I absolutely agree.
Okay, because like I said, I don't mean that to come across as rude, but I just think that sometimes the way we say certain things does reveal how we think about things, and that to me shows that there is a bias.
To me, it's an unuseful situation in the lab. When I look at endogenous retroviruses and I can use them to help maybe figure out how cancer works and how we can maybe make our therapies better, then it works for me, that's fine. But to me, it's kind of a showstopper to say that maybe something in the future, this will be beneficial and we'll understand it. To me, I'm just looking at what I have right now and what I can do with it.
That makes sense, but just because an idea isn't useful doesn't mean that it's not correct or
it
incorrect.
could totally be true. Tomorrow there might be some big revelation.
I just wanted to clarify that and to make sure I was on the same page. My question really, I'm sorry to do all that, my question really was, you had the pictures of the viruses up there, and you showed similarities in the viruses. And then you made a conclusion that because of the similarities, at one point in time they had to be identical, the same, and that they somehow split and formed. Where's the evidence of that? Because it seems to me that you're taking a logical concept, and there isn't, unless I'm wrong, because I don't have all the information, but that you're just taking what you see and making the best possible hypothesis guess. And for that guess to be correct, because we don't have the evidence, you would, in a sense, have to have faith in that hypothesis to be correct, because all the information as you see it would be best explained in this way. Isn't that the same thing as creationism, except they're choosing to look with a different bias? Does that make sense? Because I don't see how you can say that everything is the same when there's not that information out there. Does that?
Well, sure, absolutely. For endogenous retroviruses, again, when they become a part of your genome, they lose that hyper-freakish mutation capability. So we can look at one species and, hey, we see the same envelope gene in kind of the same region. then we can compare their sequences and be virtually certain that they were a single event that got passed down just like you got genes from your parents. What he was saying was that, well, how can you ever tell that they weren't two independent events? And my response is that we can tell when they're independent events, even from the lemurs that he brought up were 3.2 and about 4.1 million years ago. It's like we aren't just looking at sequences and making things up in our mind, like seeing patterns, like I said before. It's like they're very specific sequences that we find in locations that don't make sense to us outside of the paradigm of common descent.
One of the things that is common in the molecular clock thinking is that when a creationist sees differences in DNA, we see differences that have been different from the beginning and have even become more different through mutation, which is an accident, a mistake, if you will, in replicating. When an evolutionist sees these differences, they see time. They will make an estimate on how often a mutation will occur, then they'll add up how many mutations are there, and add up the time. That's where we get the term molecular clock. And this is based on the assumption that you actually do have a regular mutation rate. Then we actually do know what those rates are. And so evolutionists will see differences in genetics, and they'll see time. We'll just see the differences. Created differences, and then differences that have occurred since the creation through mistakes, through accidental, random acts of mutation. But these mutations, although would take time to occur, evolutionists would say, it's 3.2 million years or 4.1 million years because of how many mutations we see. That's how long it would take for those mutations to occur. But that is based on that assumption. Again, assumptions aren't bad, but assumptions aren't data.
And I would say our assumptions are functional. So we'd like to know when exactly HIV was transferred from chimpanzees to humans. Again, just a wonder why question. And we used to think that maybe it was around the 1930s because we only had one sample from the 1960s and we were trying to compare it to HIV today. And then we found another sample. This guy hunted through stacks and stacks and stacks of this wax-embedded tissue looking for HIV. I did not want this guy's job, but he got a Nature paper because he found HIV in another sample. And we found that HIV had actually mutated a lot more in the sequence of time than we thought it had. So we pushed it back to the 1900s when it originally crossed over into human. So we might be making guesses, but it's helping in HIV research and cancer research, so I'm fine with my guesses.
Guesses are being used as a guide to research because a paradigm is guiding the research.
It's functional.
Functional in looking for what you hope to find. Just something here about the molecular clocks. Just last year, if our molecules are constantly changing with threat to proper survival, it struck me this model of constant change is never challenged. This is not, just that there's a number of people, and I showed you two other ones very recent that have questioned the molecular clock assumptions. You can work as though a paradigm is actual. You can work as though it is doing something. We do that with orbital hybridization in molecules bonding with each other, even though we know orbital hybridization does not ever happen. It's not the truth. But we have a model that we can use. It's functional, but everybody knows orbital hybridization doesn't happen when molecules bond together. It's a model that works. It has predictive, heuristic value, and it's functional, but it doesn't mean it's true. As a matter of fact, everybody knows that one is not true.
I have a question for Abby. You are obviously an evolutionist, that's why you're here. But I'm sorry. But do you believe that through these random chances and natural selection that we are moving closer and closer through evolution to a perfect being sometime in the future?
No, unfortunately not. Like there's no, what's hard for people to kind of get sometimes is that we don't know where we're going. Like anytime HIV evolves, it doesn't have any like wants or needs or desires. It's just going where evolution takes it. So, I mean, we're going to be, okay, I've got a fun Lucy story. So I went to go see Australopithecus afarensis when she was in Houston. My brother was getting married. And she was in this glass box, and if you touch this box, like, alarms would start going off, and lights and sirens. So all the kids that were there, like, their moms and dads were, like, clutching onto them. They're like, my kid is not going to be the one to set off this alarm. And this little girl was looking at this mock-up of Lucy. And she was talking to her mom, and she knew she was about to say something kind of rude. And she was like, why is she so hairy? Because she was like this ape creature. And the mom laughed, and she was like, well, you know, that's your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandma. And your great-great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter will think you kind of look funny, too. So, you know, we have no direction. It's not going to be better. It might be worse than where we're at now, depending on what happens in our environment. But we definitely change, and we're changing in different ways due to our medical care. You know, I say if the HIV epidemic had happened 5 million years ago, we wouldn't have had our modern technology to battle it. But now that we do, I mean, we have a moral obligation to figure out a vaccine, figure out new therapies. So instead of letting HIV just decimate our population until HIV is co-evolved nicely with us and we're nicely co-evolved with it, like what happened in other primates, like we're actively fighting it. And that will have effects on how humans evolve in the future too.
Okay, thank you.
I was just listening when you made your analogy about the Legos, the little girl playing with the Legos and the dog chews up one, and she obviously wouldn't chew up a dozen of them to make them all the same. That'd be ridiculous. And I was just thinking, you know, there's an awful lot of kids in America, and an awful lot of kids have Legos, and a lot of kids have dogs. Dogs are probably going to end up chewing on the Legos. And I was thinking he made a point about the two lemurs. Yeah, both of them contracted this same HIV virus, but they weren't linked together. They weren't in the same family. So I was just wondering if that's sort of like one of the dogs chewing on a Lego piece in this one little girl's bedroom, and then, 50 miles away, another dog's chewing on the exact same Lego piece in another little boy's bedroom.
Yep.
So isn't that kind of like saying that when animals were evolving, one animal didn't necessarily have to get the HIV virus and pass it down the chain for everybody to have it. So it could have been that animals were all there together. God created them all. And one animal got the HIV virus, and then another one got the exact same virus. So it didn't necessarily have to be passed down the chain.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened in this particular case. But with the original paper, they didn't know whether they were the same or whether it was one event. But it was a PNAS paper. They wanted to get it out first. And so I believe this next one was a PLOS paper, where they went back and were like, this was our original hypothesis, and this is what actually happened. So yeah, it's like two different kids had their dogs chew on their Legos, but you can tell the Legos apart. You don't think that it came from the same child getting it chewed up the same way. And it was related to HIV, it's in the same family, but the virus that infected these lemurs was very different from HIV.
All right. Yeah, I have a question for the doctor. When you were talking about the two dinosaurs, when you were talking about the dinosaur having like the blood vessels and all that, did they really come out like that, or was that after they were soaked? And things, we read that through that little magazine that they were soaked for many hours to be able to show these blood cells.
Yes, you had to dissolve the calcium carbonate rocks that were around them, and then organic tissue fell out. It was a very mild acid bath, sort of like vinegar. to dissolve those things. And then there shouldn't, normally when you do that to a fossil, it completely dissolves because it's petrified, it's rock, it's lithified, it's permineralized. But when all the minerals were dissolved, there was flesh tissue left. And this was not the first time that had been discovered, that sort of thing. We found mummified skin, we found dinosaur beef jerky on the leg bone of the Santana raptor, which is supposed to be the evolutionary ancestor of T-Rex, so it's much older than that. And these things are biological artifacts. They shouldn't have been able to survive that long. It's just you can look at it in the Chemical Rubber Company's Handbook of Chemistry and Physics, what the rate laws, what the rate equations are, what the rate constants are for the decomposition reactions of proteins. And you can tell, even kept completely dry, because water will disassemble proteins, because the peptide bond is a dehydration synthesis bond. So if you hydrate it, it will unsynthesize and it'll decompose. But even dry, even squeezed dried, these things shouldn't be able to last. The amino acids should let go of each other, tops 100,000 years. Yet we have found biological pigment molecules in a 350 million year old crinoid stem that was discovered 2 years ago by a grad student and a professor at Ohio State. It was a crinoid stem with pigment molecules, complex biological molecules. So this is one of those things that because people just, I like to ask the question, you're a creationist, you believe there are 6,000 years old? I said, I sure do. Got a problem with that? Well, what makes you think it's older than that? And then they'll always run to carbon-14 uranium dating and things like that, which are based on all 4 assumptions. But then we've actually got something like this that's not based on assumption. We got hard data. We got something under the microscope, you can hold it in your hand, you can look at it, you can smell it. Dinosaur veins, what are you going to do with that? They can't last that long. So instead of saying, clearly they're not that old, the main establishment of the scientific community, not the creationist portion of the scientific community, the evolutionary portion has said, well, we just don't really understand decay like we thought, or we just don't really understand fossilization like we thought we did. But of course, the bone is still 68 million years old, 90 million years old, 350 million years old. That's going against data. That's the exact opposite of science. I have to make that indictment.
But are you taking to the assumption that this is physically impossible to happen?
It's physically observed to happen, just like micro variation is physically observed to happen. There is no dispute that these cells exist. The photo I got came from the PBS Nova website. It was a television special hosted by Neil deGrasse Tyson, a very well-known evolutionist, a very good host, as a matter of fact, and he was at the Beyond Belief Atheist Conference in Austin, Texas last year. He's an avowed atheist, but like I said, a very good show host. But here you go. This is where I got this. There's the citation. Look it up yourself. Everybody knows these tissues are real. It's data-driven thinking, not assumption-driven.
Well, I'm just saying, if you take it into the assumption that happens.
The assumption of what?
The assumption that it cannot survive. Then why was it such a big deal when we found it? Because
the evolution model requires hundreds of millions, even billions of years for enough time for it to work. That's why it's significant. If these things really are only 4,000 years old, then it makes a big difference in whether evolution is even likely.
But then you're just going against the time scale. You're not disproving the methods, you're just proving the time.
That's because evolutionists are wedded to a 4.5 billion year time scale. We are wedded to a 6,000 year old time scale, and this goes with us better.
But you're just nitpicking certain parts out.
Whoa. This is not nitpicking, it's the data. I'll just put it up there and say, there it is.
Then show the rest of the dinosaurs that do not survive, the tissue that did not survive, and let them and see what happens to them.
Well, there are buffalo that died on the Great Plains here in Oklahoma, and none of their tissues have survived, and we know they were here 200 years ago.
But that's still bone, and that can be fossilized. Fossils are different.
But this actually survived. How could it? It can't, according to known laws of science. It can't survive this long.
But to what you're saying, the laws you're putting out there, your laws cannot change, no matter what will happen ever.
I didn't make up that law. Like I said, you can look up the the rate equation for the decomposition of proteins in the CRC Handbook of Chemistry and Physics. I didn't make it. That's logged in. Everybody's got that available.
I know that, but I'm just saying. And also,
You're saying
also
what?
relating to this, I'm also questioning. All right, so when you said that everything was created, you're saying everything was created, like humans were created at the same time that dinosaurs were, and are you saying they lived together at the same time?
Yes.
All right, then why are we not finding any, what you call, fossilized human remains that are in correlation with dinosaurs in the same strata?
With 24 chromosomes each.
With 24 chromosomes.
Well,
I mean, if you're saying that they have not changed entirely from, to the point where they could have came from a common ancestor, tell me where they are at. Because there's no human remains 25 million years back in the strata.
You're talking about no human remains 25 million years worth of depth, according to evolutionary assumptions, right?
Well, that'd be geology. That wouldn't be evolution, that'd be geology.
It'd be evolutionary geology. I just mentioned a subject called flood geology that is a 6,000 year old.
Flood geology is going off based off of text.
Well, if you look at the magnitude of the formations I was telling you about, it's based on observation too. Everything's based on a text, and everything is based on observation.
But that would be biased to say that it fits what you say. To say that,
It's biased to say this fits what I say?
Well, no, I'm saying what you're saying when you're talking about the flood over North America, which you showed on the slide up here earlier. That would be biased to fit what you were saying relating to the text.
Only if there was another explanation possible. But if you can think of one, say it. But continent-wide, single geologic formations of deposits, there is no known mechanism. Every evolutionist on the planet believes that there was a worldwide flood on the planet Mars, for goodness sake. 3.8 billion years ago, an asteroid smacked into Mars, and the whole planet got flooded. They believed that it could happen on Mars, and they believed the Grand Canyon on Mars, which is 1,500 miles long, is 3 times longer than ours, they believed that formed in 3 weeks. Well, why would they say all this kind of stuff? They even call this the Noachian period of Martian geologic history because they named it after Noah. Now, they believe a planet that today is a total desert, it's dry as a bone, had a flood of planetary proportion. They look at a planet here that's only 1/4 land, the rest is 2 miles deep in water, and they make fun of me for saying we once had a flood. We look like we just got over a flood right now. Now, Mars's gravity is only 0.38 Rs. That's why it can't hold an atmosphere. Its atmosphere is only 1/100th as thick as ours. And so...
would that explain the water? Would that explain the water?
It would explain why the water's not there anymore. And I believe there was a flood on Mars. We've got evidence. We've got rivers, valleys, beaches and oceans. It's all dry as bone right now. Canyons and everything. And deltas, but all the water's gone now. But we say things like these kinds of giant formations can form in only thousands of years. And they make fun of us for saying that. But they believe it happened in a matter of hundreds of years or weeks on Mars. You see, this is not letting the left hemisphere know what the right hemisphere is thinking. This upsets me because that's disingenuous. Now, and then I'll have someone just want to, say, well, Noah's flood, of course, has got to be a fairy tale when it's scientifically there's evidence that points to it. And if you can believe that Mars could be flooded, why can't you believe that the planet Earth could have been flooded once? Why? Indeed. Why not?
My question was...
Okay, your question.
The other question was actually not related to the flood. It was just... I kind of got off there. My original question was when you thought humans and when all we were created at the same time, you're talking about the geographic strata when we got off. And my question was asking about the humans. I mean, if you're saying that there's a flood, and you're saying, and also with you said there's 4 different pools gene pools for humans.
Yes.
And, there is scientific data supporting that.
Yes.
But what about the animals? You're saying there's 2 of each kind, and what about their gene pools? There's many more than just one gene pool for any animal out on as you said, that came off the ark.
Mm-hmm.
So, where do these other animals come from?
Well, let's see.
You're saying the flood killed out everything besides what was on the ark.
Besides what was on the ark, yes.
And then what happened to the plants? That they didn't say anything about plants being on the ark. They also didn't say anything about
a lot of plants went extinct too. The Permian extinction, which evolutionists call it, makes the Cretaceous extinction look like a picnic. Many, many species didn't make it through Noah's flood.
But if you're saying that, if the plants went extinct,
that was millions of years ago.
What?
Can you put a date on the Permian extinction in terms of years ago?
What is called the Permian extinction is really like what you're talking about. If I can relate these two. What we're talking about is layers of rock that have different kinds of fossils. Layers of rock with different kinds of fossils. The next layer of rock doesn't have a bunch of different fossils. It was in the rock before, correct? They're missing in the upper layer, next upper layer, right? So we call that an extinction event. Now I would say that happened at some point during Noah's flood. An evolutionist would say the Permian extinction happened 250 million years ago, or that the Cretaceous extinction happened 65 million years ago. All you really have is a layer of rock that doesn't have fossils from the previous layer. The coelacanth fish went extinct.
Actually, they actually found a living specimen of coelacanths. So.
We have coelacanths alive today, but they're missing from the fossil record for 100 million years.
Yes.
They avoided being
we
fossilized.
haven't found them. We're not saying they're not fossilized. We have not found them.
Well,
we don't scrap the bottom of the
I'm
ocean.
talking about data. You're talking about it's out there somewhere.
It's possible.
That's hope.
You're relating back to. Well, he's relating back.
Well, are you talking about an actual fact or a hope?
I'm not talking about hope. I'm talking
Well,
about
you're hoping coelacanth fossils are there. You're actually told me they are.
If they are living now, would they have existed then? And if they existed then, wouldn't there be some evidence of them existing then in between there and now? Just because we haven't found them since 1932 when we caught one.
Just because we haven't found them. Yes, they've
doesn't
existed.
mean they don't exist.
They've existed all this time, but they did not leave fossils. There's tons of fossils in the layer that evolutionists say is 100 million years ago, all the way back to 365 million years ago.
Do any of them look like mammals? Do any of the pre-Permian fossils even remotely resemble a single mammal that exists on the planet today?
Well, what about the Morganucodon rat that we're supposed to have evolved from? Doesn't that resemble a mammal today?
Is that in pre-Permian rock?
It's in Permian. It's 210 million years ago. According to evolutionary timescales, you can go down to Sam Noble Museum and see a little model of it. It looks just like a mouse. Except they made it 2 times bigger. According to anyone who looks at it, sir, have you ever seen these? It's a mouse. It looks just like a little rat sitting there. And they drew that from bones.
Is there a single published scientific paper that credits that with being a mouse or a mammal of any kind?
Look it up.
I'd be astonished. I follow this stuff off and on. I'd be astonished that it wouldn't be in every single newspaper around the world because it would completely overthrow the entire evolutionary model as it stands today. You're telling me that they discovered it, and somehow or another it's been kept secret from the rest of the world, and you're revealing it to us tonight.
I never said it was a secret. It's in all the museums. It's in the Chicago Field Museum and the Museum of Natural History, the Smithsonian in D.C. There's the Morganucodon rat fossil. There it is, a little brass model of it. Are you denying that that fossil exists, sir?
I'm denying that it is even closely related to mammals.
Then why is it called the mother of all mammals by the Smithsonian scientist? The article in the Smithsonian magazine, sir, calls it the mother of all mammals.
Wouldn't that be going against you, though? Because if you're saying it's a mother of all mammals...
Oh, I just think it was a rat. I don't think it's us. The Smithsonian says
that
that's
mother of all mammals, then you're saying, then you're correlating that mother of mammals. We are mammals.
I do not believe that rat is the mother of all mammals. That's what the Smithsonian said. Why would it call it the mother of all mammals if they don't believe it was a mammal? I suppose you should, sir, because it's what every evolutionist on the planet believes. You should. Okay, you're talking about why there aren't. Evolutionists have got their missing links, and yes, we have our missing links too. There's nothing a creationist wouldn't like better than to find a human skull stuck in a T-Rex tooth. Okay, we'd love to find that. You've got your missing links, we've got ours. You've got your explanations for it, we've got ours. Ours are that bird and mammal fossils always float when they die. That's when they're drowned in a flood. That's why you give them cement overshoes and throw them off the East River Bridge. The animals would be fossilized in the places where they actually live, at the elevations they live. It's no surprise that the very deepest of all fossil layers has wormholes and bacteria fossilized in it. because that's where they live today. If the whole world was covered in a flood today, what would you have at the bottom layers? You'd have the worms, the clams, the benthic bottom feeders, then you'd have your littoral zone things, you'd have your fishes, then you'd have things that live at a higher elevation would be overcome by the sedimentation. Next, you'd have your amphibians, reptiles and birds, and birds and mammals float, the reptiles would sink. You also have mobility and ability to escape. If Noah's flood actually happened, it is a historical event, then you'd have different mobilities to escape. Plus, we don't find polar bears and humans living together that much. We find things living in different habitats now. In Gray, Tennessee, the new fossil bed that was discovered that had alligators and red pandas together was a shock for everyone because these things are supposed to live in separate places. We expect to find things in separate rock formations if they live in separate places. That's not too far-fetched.
Sycamore trees or any of the trees today that we don't find on these layers. There's certainly no mobility there. I don't see trees running to the top of the mountain.
If you're going to mention plants, you're going to go wading into an area that evolutionists have a terrible time. The evolution of plants onto the land during the Silurian rocks. The angiosperm evolution, which Darwin called that abominable mystery, and still isn't solved by evolutionary theorists. You really want to go to plants now?
I would.
Pick
so
one.
my undergraduate research was in a different kind of transposable element. So plants don't have retroviruses, but they have these things called transposable elements. And so actually the history of our crops is very, very cool because the ancestral crop, after it went through a complete chromosomal duplication, that's how we got a lot of the cereal crops that we use today. So instead of just having small portions of genes duplicating and diverging, we had an entire chromosomal duplicating and diverging because plants can tolerate a lot more plasticity than humans can.
Plants can be octoploid instead of diploid like us. They can have eight.
Don't they call jumping genes?
Which ones?
Is it what they call jumping genes, but it jumps in segments?
Oh, yes. I thought you said jumping beans, and
No,
I was like, no. But yeah, jumping genes. And again, so plants don't have endogenous retroviruses, but they have these transposable elements. And they move around a lot. And every time they move, they leave little footprints behind that we can follow exactly how we follow, say, the LTRs and endogenous retroviruses.
I have a question for both of you. This is in regard to time and decay, so it's kind of on the heels of what we've just been talking about. Dr. John Ross, a Harvard scientist and evolutionist, says that there are no known violations of the second law of thermodynamics. Have either of you in your research ever found anything that would refute that statement? And what can we gain from it?
Well, I believe that the second law of thermodynamics is for closed systems, and the Earth is considered more of an open system, so we get energy from the sun, and that's how plants can grow and so on. So we aren't really a closed system that the second law would.
Well, with all due respect, there are four conditions that are necessary, and you're speaking to the first two regarding being an open system. The problem is that you also have to have the ability to capture energy, and then you have to be able to have a mechanism in which you can convert it, right? Those are things that would also be part of the second law, and now we're talking about entropy. So
I think plants do that pretty well.
And then they die, right?
And we eat plants, and we use their energy.
Plants are living things. No one disputes that plants take the energy and channel it, capture it very carefully, control it, and then use it to manufacture glucose molecules from water and carbon dioxide. But how the plant get there is the question evolutionists answer, not how does it work. Everyone agrees how it works.
Didn't we answer that?
It does go against the law of thermodynamics, second law of thermodynamics, only temporarily. It's living on borrowed time. So, Isaac Asimov said in an article in the Smithsonian Magazine called In the Game of Energy and Thermodynamics, You Can't Even Break Even, he said that the second law of thermodynamics is the most powerful generalization that mankind has been able to make about the universe. It's, you can say the Earth's an open system, and certainly energy does come in, but without some means, some mechanism already in place to capture that energy and channel it and use it, all you have is hot rocks sitting in the sun, and that's all you can get by the law of thermodynamics. And so open system makes no difference to this.
For a fun thought experiment, because I study viruses, a lot of scientists think that when you go back to the very beginning of life on this planet, that maybe it started as an RNA organism. And of course I'm interested because I study RNA viruses, so I really like getting into this stuff. And so some people think that an hypothesis for the origin of life on this planet was that organisms, pre-organisms I guess you'd call them, got their energy from thermal vents. So heat from thermal vents transferred that energy to RNA molecules that, hypothesis, that could go through PCR sort of reactions of cooling by going away from the thermal vent and annealing temperatures of moving towards the thermal vent. Now these are all thought of experiments that are just for fun, but there's lots of places that we can get energy.
Well, since you brought up the idea about where we started,
Sure.
I think that is a pretty important question that we'd want to answer. And since life can't start in oxygen, since oxygen is corrosive, and since it can't start without oxygen because it's necessary to sustain life, and since it can't start in water because water, as we talked about with hydrolysis, what Dr. Jackson talked about, where do we go from there?
I think a lot of the current hypotheses, because they are just thought experiments right now that we use based on the chemistry we have and just the fun ideas people think of. I think that's part of the fun of like these origin of life hypotheses. But yeah, there's micro environments. I mean, the world back then was very different than the world we have now. So to say that, you know, we need oxygen or we can't have oxygen, it might be very different when we're talking about an RNA world where there's just sheer selfish genes that are trying to protect themselves from other pirates. I mean, you can have a lot of fun thought experiments, but I wouldn't go as far to say that X was impossible or Y was impossible.
Of course, RNA molecules on contact with oxygen will oxidize. So there would have to be no oxygen in the RNA world.
Okay.
The earlier didn't have very much oxygen.
That is, it's not fun as much as it is fun because it's a puzzle. It's a catch-22. Without oxygen, there's no ozone layer to protect the RNA molecules from the full force of the ultraviolet rays of the sun and other radiations. And with oxygen, you oxidize. Everybody knows we're supposed to eat our antioxidants because oxygen and other free radicals, other oxidizing agents will destroy biological molecules on contact. The oxygen you breathe in is carefully channeled and shunted around your body and kept away from these tissues. If you get free radicals loose, they can cause mutations, mutagenic, carcinogenic, tissue damage, and that has to be repaired. So these things, like the gas line in your car, controls carefully this explosive gasoline, like the channels in your body control this volatile oxygen. But naked molecules of RNA just floating in the water would be disassembled. The water itself would tend to do a dissolution reaction on proteins and nucleotides, nucleic acids. So there has to be something hypothesized which can be fun to do. And again, it could actually be true, but it's only an idea, and right now there is a total catch-22. No life with oxygen, no life without oxygen in the RNA world hypothesis. And that's a problem. It's a question. Maybe they'll find the answer, but right now you can believe in evolution if you want, but not because of the RNA world hypothesis. That isn't worth trusting yet. It hasn't borne the data side of things yet. It's not data-driven. And there's nothing wrong with not being data-driven. It is wrong saying this is the way it was when it's a hypothesis. According to the
But I would
hypothesis.
say we do store, when I make DNA in the lab or RNA, we store it in a water solution. So, I mean, I would say people far more clever than here I have thought of fun ideas. So seriously, go to Google and see what other people have thought of. It's fun.
I have a bunch of questions, if you don't mind. Question number one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sad not. if cancer is a combination of between the 8.5 retroviruses that we have in our body, or 8.5%, then is it more likely that, if I may so, 10,000 years ago, cancer wasn't as prevalent?
I think what we're finding now, I wouldn't say that all cancer is caused by endogenous retroviruses at this point. There might be a cause element, and there might be an effect that's perpetuating cancer. But certainly, cancer is a very diverse disease. So to say like all breast cancers, all colon cancers, I can't say that. But they do play a role in these cancers. But I would say that probably what happened is that people weren't living as long as we're living now. They weren't living to 60 years old to get heart attacks and to get certain kinds of cancer. I think they might have had different problems to deal with. But a selection pressure isn't much of a pressure if it happens after reproductive age. So if you've already passed on your genes, so say you get this, there's an endogenous retrovirus that gives you cancer after you're 20, but everybody has kids when they're 16, let's say way back then it doesn't matter. But if one of these individuals, say, accumulated a mutation that made this retrovirus non-functional, well then he could still have kids when he was 20, and he could still have kids when he was 25, and perpetuate that non-functional variant.
That's kind of what I thought it was being along the lines of. Have these EOV viruses, have they ever found, are they big enough to be found in the fossil record at all?
No.
Like finding in...
That's it's the tricky part with viruses, is that they're too tiny. They don't fossilize very well. There are some kinds of viruses that can live a long time just in the soil out on their own. That's why polio is still an issue in some parts of the world where we've done all these vaccination efforts, we've stopped them, and then people are getting sick again because polio was hiding in the dirt. But retroviruses, they're wusses outside of us. So say I have HIV and I get blood all over a toilet seat or something. That won't survive for very long. So even if someone sat down on a toilet seat, you could get HIV just from using the same toilet as someone else or water fountain. They're wusses, but the only fossils we have are the ones that we have in our genome. And what I think is pretty cool is that, I make fun of these endogenous retroviruses because they made a mistake. They stumbled into an A instead of the cell they were going for. But which is the more fit virus? The original one that infected the cells it was supposed to infect and subsequently went extinct, or the one that became endogenized and is now in every primate on the planet? I think that's kind of a cool artifact.
Yeah, that was pretty good. I really enjoyed that one. But let's talk about, if I may, some of you, Doctor. When we discussed the fact that a lot of the differences between me and an ape is only in percentiles. The Carl Sagan once said that if like an alien on a different planet came to Earth and tried to eat one of us, more likely he could not digest us. Could that not be the same reason that we are able to switch our DNA pairs around and give each other all kinds of interesting proteins back and forth?
If different living things on Earth were based on different proteins, different amino acids, they're all based on 20 amino acids building all the proteins in us. If it wasn't, then it's true there'd be certain species couldn't derive nutrition from other species. As it is, I can eat a piece of fried chicken and all the chicken proteins, I can tear them apart into amino acids and put them back together into Jackson proteins, and I'm happy. Now, when you start to talk about aliens and life forms that are based on some other kind of biochemistry, now, of course, we're in a very fun area of a mental playground that's completely out there with the Loch Ness Monster and stuff like that. And that's okay. But yeah, but now you can say anything and hypothesize anything. As far as we know, all life is based on, well, what we see here, the kind of biochemistry we're talking about.
I wanted you to walk that way.
Paul Davies is thinking that maybe there is life that's here based on a totally different biochemistry, and because of our detection methods. We just don't know it's here, and if we could discover it, he feels it could show that there was a second Genesis or a second evolution of life, and that these things never made it beyond microorganisms, and they're responsible for desert varnish and all kinds of other strange things. But that's just fun theoretical stuff.
Well, if I may use another scientist term, Occam's razor.
Yes.
If it's more likely, if everything being equal, the simplest answer is the correct one. If I may say so, is it more interesting that, or is it more likely that my DNA and my proteins are here so when I die, something can eat me, and when a fish dies and I catch it, I can eat it due to the fact we're on a basic family tree from the top to the bottom and from back and forth. That way we can survive in this harsh environment that this is the planet Earth. And if I can't eat a fish, I will starve. If the fish can't eat me in whatever shock, I guess, then it'll die.
Are you saying that the fact that animals eat each other is proof of evolution? Because we're all the same family?
Only on the very small scale that the DNA and the proteins are interchangeable between each other. We don't kind of like tell them off.
Wouldn't this also be possible if creation were true?
Well, let's go there.
Actually, wouldn't it be inevitable?
Let's go there then.
Yeah, I mean, let's go to both places because this is transparent to the issue.
Excellent, yes. My next question is, if there is this creation, as you like to say, and I'm more apt to believe anything if the evidence is there, if this is so, then you state that this Earth must be only 6,000 years old. And let's give that 6,013, as the gentleman pointed out.
Have we left the fish eating each other now?
Well, let's just put that aside, that way we can have that next.
Okay, don't forget it.
No, listen.
Okay, go on.
Very well. If your God is, if I may say so, omnipotent, and if he's being omnipotent, can you dictate that he only has his one day equals your one day? Because if that's so, God, you would put a leash around your God, saying he can only follow my rules as dictated by me and others of my religious beliefs.
I put a leash on God by saying a day is 24 hours.
And then God can say it's 48 hours or 30 years.
Well, how would 48 hours help some non-biblical framework? It would help evolution.
Well, I'm saying, let's say
Are you talking about the verse in the Bible that says a day is as 1,000 years in the sight of the Lord?
Sure.
That's the one you're talking about?
Let's go with that.
Okay, let's go back to 6,013 years ago and give every single day 1,000 years. Every single day 1,000 years. I worked this out because people ask me this question. Do the math. You still only get 2.5 billion years. If yesterday was 1,000 years and all the days of your life were each 1,000 years, you still only get 2.5 billion years, 2.2 billion years, and evolutionists need 4.5 billion years. So really, we're talking theology now about how God views time. If he's infinite, time is inconsequential, I would imagine, but it's only philosophical.
I was handing out an olive branch trying to help bridge the gap between Christianity and religious and science.
Well, it's true. Maybe some forms of Christianity, but you are actually talking to someone who is what I refer to as a biblical Christian, being a biblical literalist. And that's why evolution and the Bible can't be true both in my understanding. Because if you add up all the generations, and they're all there, everyone agrees Jesus lived about 2,000 years ago, and you add all the generations from Jesus, you've got all the names and how old these people were. Add it all up, you get 4004 BC. So I go, okay, that's a history book. If the Earth's older than that, then what happened to all those billions of years of time? The time frame is weird. And then also, you've got that all living things were created during the same week of time, not during hundreds of millions of years. You've just got a plethora of difficulties. I do not see. You could be a Christian evolutionist and just say the Bible doesn't mean what it says. And yeah, you could do that, and many people do. It's called theistic evolution, that evolution was God's way. You can say that if you want, but everything that anybody says does not make it so. We're trying to find out what really happened. And if you're not on an honest search for that, and you're only trying to trip up people who are, you gotta, watch it. The 6,000 years, I guess we dealt with that. Do we go back to the fish now?
Well, yes.
I want to go back to the fish for a
Okay,
second.
would you want to go back to
I
the fish?
think that you bring up something that's kind of fun, just because I'm half Catholic and half Jewish, so you can imagine how that would. Wouldn't that have made kosher laws a lot more easier and more fun if we just couldn't eat pigs and we just couldn't eat shrimp?
Yeah, I can see where the joke comes from.
Or we couldn't eat apples, for all that matter.
Well, my whole thing is, if I may say so, that it's there. I mean, you don't want to look at the facts are there. I mean, we have to eat something.
Okay, so you are saying the fact that I can eat other animals is evidence for evolution only?
Oh, yeah, it's a step
Yes?
in that direction. Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm sorry, I have to do this. How many people here think that just because animals can eat each other, evolution must be true? I'm sorry. See? That does not help. Now, there are many reasons why you could believe in evolution, but not that.
That's a straw man argument.
That's a foolish.
Absolutely. Consensus never determines truth. Reasonably does it. But everyone, no one is going to be compelled to say, well, this is evidence for evolution, since animals can eat each other, because it would be true if 4 made us, for crying out loud, or if Lucky the Leprechaun did. You see, this is a transparent to the issue thing. Why are you saying it? It makes no difference to the argument in the tiniest way.
We come from the same point.
Only by that one interpretation of how we got here, yes. But by creation or evolution, animals can eat each other.
Okay, I'm trying to be kind of helpful for your argument in the same way.
You're trying to, in what way?
Well, you state that if there's a God, he made us all. Couldn't we start out that he decided the smallest object can eat one another and then move up the evolutionary chain?
Well, yeah, God could have created things by evolution. Yeah, certainly could. But then then you need to look at things like the data I showed. You need to ask yourself some questions about the geology, and you got to decide whether the Bible's just fairy tales or not.
And in all fairness, if you believe that every word of the Bible is absolutely true and uncontroversially so, then you have to ask yourself why I personally haven't been stoned about 500 times over.
That's theology. Yeah, there's New Covenant, Old Covenant, all that sort of thing. It's Christianity.
Certain laws are much more written in stone than the accounts of Genesis.
As a mom, the whole point of this debate, basically, you agree that evolution is based off of assumption, presumption, all of that.
I would say that even if it were, that it's functional. And I can use it in the lab to do good things.
Okay. I don't debate that one bit. But the whole point of this was to prove that basically there are 2 theories out there. And only one is being taught as fact in schools. And what should happen is both should be taught in schools as theories.
That's another topic.
I'd like to answer that.
I think that's another topic.
My dad is a science teacher. He teaches physics and math. And so always, it's like science education has been very important to me. And the California Association of Science recently did a survey, and they found that only 59% of people knew that it took a year for the Earth to go around the sun. There are a lot of problems with making sure everybody understands the basics in science.
Plus the variance.
I would say that the problem comes in that there are people outside of this particular theology that don't follow that particular creation model. So if you were going to teach the young Earth creationist model, then you would also need to teach Native American creation models and Hindu creation models. And so what I feel is the best is to let parents and churches teach those to kids. I was taught those when I was a kid. But then when you get into a science classroom, you have to teach the things that scientists believe, whether they're Hindu or Christian or atheist or whatever. And those are things that we all can agree on.
Actually, if the students in the classroom, if we're teaching a class and 90% of the students didn't believe in evolution, or that they did believe in biblical creation, it'd be bad educational practices to ignore the fact that this is actually what's going on in the minds of your students. The constructivist theory of math and science education, constructivism, it builds and constructs upon what the students already have. If we need to modify them or lead them to reconstruct what their frameworks are, then so be it. But discussion in class.
In a philosophy classroom, if you do that in a science classroom, then you're broaching the separation of church and state.
We discuss morality in science classrooms. We discuss stem cell research, cloning, and genetic engineering.
We discuss them at a very superficial level.
We discuss them at a morality and ethical level.
Controversies. So I can tell you a big controversy in evolution in my particular kind of research. So HIV mutates a whole lot, right? So all RNA viruses do that. So people who study these viruses call them a quasi-species. If you want to start a big fight in an evolutionary conference, you go into any room and scream, quasi-species are real, and then just close the door and fist fights will break out. Because evolutionary biologists absolutely hate us using this word, because they're thinking we're just making up terminology because it's already covered, and it's just a large population that's really diverse, and biologists are like, no, your large populations are nothing compared to our large populations. And then you get chemists in there because they originally had the term quasi-species, and they start freaking out. That's an inappropriate controversy to be teaching kids. Like, I didn't know what that stuff was even when I was in college. It's a very specific controversy. And then you have other controversies, like there were some fellows from the Discovery Institute that came down, I guess about a month ago, and they were saying these controversies that should be taught in class, like about junk DNA and whether there was one universal common ancestor. And unfortunately, like, the controversies they were bringing up were false controversies. That's why I wanted to really clarify that junk DNA piece in my second part. And like there's ethical controversies with, say, stem cells. And that could have a portion of the classroom for discussion, and even better in an ethics or philosophy class. But the kinds of controversies I have with stem cells are whether a B cell can de-differentiate into a precursor cell and redifferentiate into a macrophage, and whether that's localized or whether it happens at a systemic level.
Well, why would that be inappropriate to discuss in class?
Children don't have that level of understanding. That's a very specific argument.
But they do know about Obama versus McCain in a government class.
Yes, they do. It's a government class.
Yeah. I'm saying if it is something the students can understand, why is it inappropriate to talk about a controversy?
It's far too advanced.
It's in the minds of many, many people.
Your views in our classroom as fact.
But according to the scientific field considers it a fact.
Not all.
It is a supreme majority, sir. To say otherwise is disingenuous.
Always a supreme minority leads the way in any change in science.
Unfortunately, they were the ones who came first. We had to prove our case. And you're suggesting a vast conspiracy where the Chinese are into it, and the Russians, and the Africans, and everyone's in on this.
I'm not suggesting a conspiracy at all. I'm suggesting that it is not inappropriate to discuss in a classroom anything that's controversial, that's already in the minds of the students and they're capable of comprehending.
And if you have time for that in the scientific classroom after you teach
Time
that it takes
for class
365 days, yeah. My parents are teachers. I know exactly how much time they have.
I started teaching high school in 1980. I know that. And it will take longer.
Standardized testing.
It will take longer to teach a unit, but the students will learn it better. Controversy, if you were a government teacher during an election year, the discussions you could have would be fabulous. And the discussions that I had in my biology and earth science classes were wonderful during the unit when I addressed origins. I've been over backwards, to be fair, about the evolution thing. My students thought I believed in evolution. I had a Catholic boy get chewed out by a Muslim girl for not believing in the Garden of Eden. So we had some really good discussions. The students liked this. It worked great. Whenever there's something controversial, it boosts student interest. They get very interested in it.
And I say that in high schools, they need to be worried about learning the basics, the amino acids, how...
This is why kids say science is boring.
But unfortunately, you have to learn the basics before you can understand these complex things and have a
You
lot
talk
of
about
fun.
science being fun.
It is.
How can it be fun if all you do is make them memorize the basics? You see, you know that class discussion is fun on any level of education.
But if you weren't educated in the topic, what kind of discussion are you having?
How educated are they going to be? They're going to be aware, and they're all going to be thinking. It's in their minds.
Ideas they already have and not be learning.
Should the flat earth theory be taught in science class or be taught in philosophy class?
If a majority of students, a majority of professors believe the flat earth theory, I'd be teaching it like I taught evolution, and I wouldn't believe it then either. But until the evolution theory finally crumbles, it should be taught in the classroom. Now, I get in trouble with some of my creationist friends because I'm against the SAT 9 Christian school version of the SAT that only has a creationist bent. If creation-believing students want to talk intelligently with their evolution-believing friends, they should understand evolution. And I will say this, you are not scientifically literate in today's world if you do not understand the rudiments of the evolutionary theory. As of 500 years ago, if you do not understand geocentrism or the flat earth, you would be scientifically illiterate. You must be informed in order to be able to converse intelligently, in order to be able to learn about it. It behooves me to understand evolution terrifically well.
I like your argument. Which discipline of science is it that agrees with you?
On what?
On the creationism side. Which discipline?
All creationist scientists in all those disciplines, sir. We are a minority, true, but to say that this is a matter of creationism versus science, I have to take personal offense because I am trained in science and I'm a teacher. And yet, I break your definition of scientist by being a creationist.
The whole controversy is between the scientific community and the non-scientific community.
You're calling me non-scientific. Did you just do that?
Very small minority.
Yes, and that's okay. Is it a non-scientific minority?
And always, in the past.
Am I a non-scientific minority?
When Einstein came out with the theory of relativity,
Am I a non-scientific minority?
Answer the doctor's question. You're going to ask.
Am I a non-scientific minority?
I don't know what you mean by non-scientific.
You said it. I'm asking you.
You said it. I don't.
Am I a non-scientific minority? I'm a minority, of course, but am I non-scientific?
I would say yes.
You believe so.
Yeah,
I'm glad you used that
scientific
word. You are
debate?
entitled to your opinion. Sir, I have 4 college degrees. I'm
And
not
yet you perform
untrained
no
in
research
science.
of your own. You perform no research of your own.
No, I'm not a researcher. I am an educator. That's true. But does that mean that I am not a scientific person?
It means you're not a scientist. There are lots
You
of
don't
kids
believe
who
that a
are
student in a
trained
classroom is a scientist who is for the first time dissecting a frog?
They are in training, but they are not scientists.
You do not believe that person is a scientist. We have a very different view of education of children and a very different view of how much credence we lend them as thinkers.
So if I get a degree in pre-med, I'm a doctor? No, there's a level of training that's required to take a title.
There are people without degrees who have tremendous bodies of knowledge. Darwin himself never had a science degree.
But he was a practicing scientist.
Yes, he was working in the field, of course. And
I
I don't think he needed to have a science degree.
A child learning the basics. I personally do not consider a scientist. They're learning about science. They could be a scientist one day. But
So what is a scientist? Someone who works as a scientist for a living? Is that the only qualification?
I would like to, yeah.
A scientist is not someone who does science.
If I read an article written by a scientist, I'm assuming that that person has a PhD in a scientific field, that that person is performing some sort of research that is related to that article.
So merely a degree makes you a scientist in a field.
And doing the research.
And doing research. So if you are doing research, those are the only people who you would consider scientists.
Professional scientists, yes.
Okay, now does that make, because I do not do research, am I a non-scientific person?
You're a non-professional scientist.
A non-professional scientist. Okay, well I thank you for the credence, because I do feel that I understand science in a different understanding than you have, of course. But I should imagine you would respect my veracity as a person of science as much as I respect yours. And yours, sir.
Why are you opposed to doing it the way it's always been done?
Whoa. Progress is never made that way, sir. That's why.
In the past, Albert Einstein had to convince the scientific community. He didn't come out and say, I believe that the theory of relativity should be taught in schools because I believe it, and I'm a small minority, and my status as a scientist and a small minority means that my theory should be taught, or my hypothesis at the time, should be taught in schools. Why not take this breadth of knowledge that you have, convince the scientific community, and then get it taught worldwide?
What do you think I'm doing? I am doing that now.
You're taking other people's research and presenting it as if they agreed with you. And I bet you that if you called any of those first authors, that they would not agree with your conclusions.
Well, they wouldn't maybe agree with my interpretation of the data, no.
Absolutely
But we would agree
But
on
they're
the
the
data.
ones actually doing the research, but you know better.
Abby, you're taking other people's research to help you with your research. It's the
Absolutely, but that's called building upon other people's research. That's so what we do. So say I publish something that moves the field forward, then how other people return the favor as to moving the field forward, they cite your paper. Now, the problem is, what happens a lot with creationist presentations is that those scientists not only don't know that creationists are saying this evidence supports creation, when they most certainly do not agree with that. And they aren't, so if another real good controversy is what role did dendritic cells play in HIV evolution, in transmission? We fight about it in the literature. We fight with each other in the literature, to each other's faces, saying, this guy is totally wrong, complete joke.
But is that person a scientist, even though you disagree with that person?
Well, absolutely.
Okay. Even though you disagree, we need to have some respect for the people who are up here, though. Even though somebody disagrees with that person, you can still call them a scientist because they more agree with what you're saying. What I'm saying is, why can't Dr. Jackson be a scientist even though he holds a different opinion than the one that you share? I mean, because it's the same situation, is it not?
He's performing no research that disagrees with what those people say.
Would it be
or
correct?
corresponds with what those people say. And he's not publishing that in the literature to be upfront about it with these
But just because
individuals.
it's not popular, does that mean it's not?
No, I'm not saying popular.
She's saying because I'm not doing
he needs to
research,
publish it.
because I'm not doing laboratory research. Would you agree that this makes the definition of scientist a rather elite group?
As a profession, absolutely.
An elite group, okay.
Physicians are an elite profession. People who can repair airlines that people fly on every day.
Could someone be
trust their lives
right
is elite.
who is not fitting your definition of a scientist about a scientific matter, and someone who does fit your definition of a scientist be wrong?
Absolutely. But the person who is wrong can't just go to a school board and declare that everyone should teach what he believes. What that person needs to do is get involved in the scientific community and get them on their side. I personally am part of a minority right now because those little modifications I was talking about with histones, some people don't really think those are important or whether they even exist. I'm not going to the Oklahoma State Legislature to demand that this particular epigenetic modification is taught in basic developmental biology sections. I'm doing research in my lab, and if I get proven wrong by my own research, I get proven wrong. But if I'm proven right, bam, I get a Nature paper. So the whole thing is like science is changing all the time. And if you prove somebody wrong, who's bigger than you on the food chain, you've got it made.
If we are going to talk about schools and textbooks then, which is not what the topic is supposed to be tonight, I would not insist on having creation put into the textbooks. If a teacher wishes to add it to their curriculum, I think they should have the freedom to do that, especially if the school board likes the idea and the students and the families are all for it. But I think every biology textbook in this country ought to have documented errors taken out of the books. And if you took everything out of the book that was given as proof of evolution, all of the embryos and the moths and the horses and things like that, then I'd be happy because there wouldn't be anything in the little chapter on evidence for evolution. Now, there's some of the new stuff that is being found that hasn't been disproved yet. I think your ERV stuff ought to go in the textbook until they find out there's a problem with that. But there's so many problems, so many. If you're talking about textbooks, the textbooks just take out the lies.
Should be a teeny tiny section when there is no one at the Health Science Center that can do research that doesn't involve evolution. Like, you don't understand like how much we need it as a tool, and it's a functional tool.
It's functional as a model, but if evolution was not true, you
then
could
why does
still
all of our
breed
research work?
RNA viruses.
And that's incredibly childish to say, oh, it's a snake, it's always going to be a snake, it's a rat.
I said you
It's
could still breed RNA viruses if evolution wasn't true.
But the endogenous retrovirus research would absolutely not work at all, and yet it does.
Well, how many of the endogenous retrovirus sequences are there in a human genome?
There are tens and tens of thousands.
Tens and tens of thousands. Well, how many of them do we share in common with chimpanzees?
It depends on how you count. If you're considering all viruses that are complete, meh. If they're considering all...
What's the range?
As far as we know, complete endogenous retroviruses, I believe there's 12 to 14.
Okay, 12 or 14 of them. And there's 8.5% of our DNA is endogenous retrovirus DNA. Well, what's the chance that out of those 98,000 genes that there'd be 14 orthologs? I mean, I'm not saying that I have proved that that's not evolution, but I am saying it could happen without. Isn't that true?
And we can tell the difference when it happens. That's what we were talking about with the lemurs.
Well, what about the ones that are considered definite common ancestor ones? How many of those are there?
I only know the complete sequences because that's only what...
14 of them?
Yes.
Okay, so there's 14 that line up with the evolution theory out of 98,000.
No, of the complete endogenous retroviruses. These have been in our genome for 30 million years at least.
By the
and
theory,
so
yes.
there's lots of them that are either... They're only the LTRs because LTRs match up and you can pop out that endogenous retrovirus when things don't line up perfectly. And then there's the ones I talked about that have mutated over time to have various stops and that sort of thing. So they're non-functional anymore. The ones we're really interested in, the ones we've looked at first, are the very young ones that can still code potentially for an endogenous retrovirus particle that can cause a cancer or a disease in people.
Well, I would agree that the 14 that you have go along with the evolution model. But what I'm questioning is, what are the chances that 14 of them would out of 98,000 anyway? Now, like I said, it could be because of evolution. It could, and so there's no other way those 14 could be.
Where a retrovirus inserts into a genome is absolutely random. Some like to insert near maybe more active genes or less active genes, but the actual insertion site...
Gene poor areas, coding poor areas, right?
Not necessarily.
So they are selective to some degree.
Some.
Well, I think we're just leaving dangling this thing that what are the chances that out of 98,000, 14 would line up with evolution? It could mean evolution is true, but it could be a third cause.
A trickster god.
No, not the trickster God, a biological cause. Personally, I don't think that God would, this is just my theology or my philosophy on it, I don't think God would go messing around with those things and trick people any more than you think that he would. I think he wouldn't, you think he couldn't, but, and I'll give you that, that's fine. But the 14 seem to be critical to the argument, are they not?
Yes.
Yes. Well, what I'm saying is they go along with the theory, much like the red blood cells in the T-Rex and the 4 gene pools for all humans go with the creation theory. I think that the red blood cells are good data against an old age for that fossil. I think that the 4 gene pools are good data for it's compatible with the flood model of human population history. It doesn't prove it, but it's compatible. And from what I can see from the 14 out of 98,000, those 14 are compatible with evolutionary theory. Would you say that
That
those
was, I think,
14
the third
are
response I
the
had.
judge's hammer comes down, it is done, it is finished, evolution is a fact because of those 14?
Personally, like I said, if every fossil remained buried, and if we somehow figured out the technology to sequence genomes without evolution, which I seriously doubt, but if we had, and if we saw all of these sequences and compared them to retroviruses we see now and saw all of these endogenous retroviral fossils, the common descent would have smacked us as an obvious conclusion in the year 2000.
So your answer is yes?
Yes.
Okay, so your answer
But
is the
personally-
14 are enough
Yes.
to be a slam dunk for evolution.
The 14
It's the final.
plus all the other leftover garbage that we've subsequently kind of looked at, but not that they were independent
They got to the
events.
same point out of millions of base pairs. How do you explain that they ended up in the same place?
Well, they had 98,000 chances.
No, they didn't. We're talking about millions and millions of base pairs, and they end up, like you said, regardless, in the same spots, in different species.
In 4,000 years.
Yes,
They
yes.
just happen to end up in the exact same spot in chimps and humans?
Yeah, of course, the creationist has got to say, well, maybe there's less randomness, even less randomness to the placement of to the insertion of these snippets than is even believed now. It is incomplete knowledge. You must agree that the knowledge is incomplete in Earth research, right?
Yes, and it's only going to be more on the evolution side as we start looking at the things that might not be as important for disease. A lot of research, unfortunately, is not focused so much on just knowing things for knowing things because it causes a disease. You're more likely to get funding for that.
I want my son, and well, all 4 of my children, to learn the fact, not the assumption or the theories, what we know for sure.
Well, evolution is a fact, and it is a theory,
But how do
and
you know
we
for
have
that
principles.
30 million? How do you know millions?
It's a whole bunch of different lines of evidence that come together. I'm just talking about my specialty, which is endogenous retroviruses. But it's people like me, it's people like the cell biologists, it's people in the geology field. We're all working together and coming to the same conclusions. So that evolution as a fact.
Evolution, I'm talking about the difference between 1,000,000 and 1,000.
Yep, there's a whole bunch of different lines of evidence, and we're all going together.
If evolution is supposed to be a process, a slow process, my question is, are there species that have irreducible complex systems that have to be in place before they can ever exist? And if there is, how does the evolution explain this?
I'd like to talk about that too, because again, to go back to plants, in undergraduate research, we were working with another lab where they had a gene duplication event, and the second gene, over the course of time, we were watching this gene, which is, this lab went back maybe 25 years. This gene was becoming irreducibly complex before their eyes. Slowly but surely, as they bred these plants, it could do without this gene even less and less. And again, looking at it from a microbiologist perspective, the big thing, of course, is the bacterial flagella. And the scientific consensus is that actually the flagella and so the reason why bacteria make you sick, not all bacteria make you sick, because like your intestine is full of bacteria, your mouth is full of bacteria. There are certain bacteria that make you sick because they have special genes that are actually given to them most of the time by viruses, which is why I think it's cool. And these genes code for a secretory pathway that allows them to shoot out these toxic proteins that actually really help the bacteria replicate. And so that system is related to the flagella, which is also another pathogenicity marker for bacteria. So the very first thing an E. coli needs to attach to you to make you poop all the time is to have a flagella so it can stick to your intestines, otherwise you'd just get pushed through. But it also needs these other things that were brought in by viruses. And again, just another pet hypothesis of mine, when you look at these secretory channels, to me, they look like a phage tail inverted. So, and again, they got it from a virus. They just sort of domesticated it and played with it a bit. I have no proof of that last thing. That's just me being a very virus-centric person. But a lot of things that maybe right now appear to be irreducibly complex weren't so not too long ago. And sometimes, I believe, there was a recent paper where they took out a lot of parts and they still got a functional machinery. So to say something is irreducible complex, I think is a risky statement, because inevitably in biology you find something a little bit simpler. And I think that's what a lot of the intelligent design creationists have found, as they put these things up as irreducibly complex or not changing, would scientists ultimately disprove them. But it's not as if, again, that these creationists are spurring this research. Like I said before, if it causes disease, the NIH really wants to give you money to figure out how to stop that disease, especially with children and diarrhea problems and infant mortality. Studying how bacteria become pathogenic and how they've evolved those pathogenic mechanisms is a very rich field of study, even if creationists had never noticed that particular bit of machinery.
Well, the whole evolution theory is all about how complexity could come about all by itself. Evolution certainly has...
In a stepwise manner.
Yeah, well, evolution has certainly thoughts on complexity. It's what all the thinking is about. I personally think that the intelligent design community comes up with some interesting questions and some good questions, but I wouldn't say it's a one-two punch to the idea of evolution or a one-two punch to the idea of a creator. But I do think how the first complexity got there in order to have things get complex, if evolution even could work, that's the real question. How are not the origins of the species, but the origin of species, period. How did the first life get started? I don't see it as just a nitpicky question. It's actually the first step in evolution. And that one also must remain in hypothesis. And again, I don't have any problem with that. What I do have a problem with is it's a fact, even though it's based on a hypothetical mechanism that really isn't described. The deep sea vents, you've got trichemotrophs living there, and did they actually then become autotrophs and heterotrophs? Did they learn to eat each other instead of eat the sulfur compounds that came out of the vents? Did they learn to photosynthesize? And how did they do that? And where did the chlorophyll molecule come from? Where did the original complexity come from to even get the evolution ball rolling? I think it behooves evolution to provide that. I can understand and commiserate with the problem that is, but it is notable by its absence how often the question is dodged or said, well, it just did. After that, you can talk about processes.
Have you thought about turning this into a scientific paper and submitting it to Nature or Science magazine instead of trying to...
And sir, if you read it, would it get published in that journal? You personally, if you were one of the reviewers.
I don't review for scientific magazines.
Yes, well, people that do think a lot like you.
Why can't we discuss it? Why does it have to have someone's stamp of approval on it?
I like stamps of approval. I like the FDA to tell me that a drug is safe. I mean, sometimes it's not as much, but I don't like this idea that anybody can talk about.
I'm sorry, I don't want to pick apart what you've been saying, but you said that certain people are scientists because they don't fit the standard.
A professional scientist. A professional scientist is a very specific thing.
I understand. And that their way of thinking that you disagree with is childish. You said the best way for this. You said the best way for this to actually amount to something is to get involved in the scientific community.
Absolutely.
And to get that, but if there's a closed door in the scientific community where we can't have an open discussion because we've already made it up in our minds that everyone's viewpoint is wrong if it's not the one that we hold.
But it's not. You don't.
Let me talk about it from a slightly different perspective. I'm a career engineer. And when I went to engineering school, because there weren't religious groups trying to get alternative views on what engineering was, on what engineering actually was, and how corrosion occurred, and how electrons acted in semiconductors, taught were the very best in the scientific, what the very best in the scientific community considered to be the very best of science. The problem here is that in the case of evolutionary theory, because it runs afoul of a number in the religious community, there is this big war over whether or not Abby knows what she's talking about. She does. She's an outstanding scientist to be. I'm sure you're an outstanding scientist. But the way that science is handled in this country is you convince the scientific community of the validity of your argument. You don't pull an end run and try to get what you think is good science taught to junior high and high school students.
I'd just like to get the bad science out of junior high.
Then write some papers and convince the scientific community of their fault.
We've been trying to do that in Texas this past month.
No.
I
That's
thought
not
that's
what we were doing.
That's why we all
The academic freedom both have no.
But just take the things that are documented as not true out of the textbooks. That's all I'm asking on textbooks.
I'm just saying there's an issue of faith on both sides.
Exactly.
When it all boils down.
The difference is a scientific person, another scientist can make and see it. A person's faith, they have to believe they will see it. You know, I can't go in there and say that every 6,000 years later my kids.
Okay, guys.
The Bible doesn't say.
Obviously, this has been good.
P-doping and N-doping mean the transistors can't work.
No, you have to believe you can see it to be able to see it.
Yeah,
Okay, all right, let's call this to a halt. I think we've got more enough tonight, and I appreciate Abby Smith and Dr.